The Nevada territory stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun, its red sand desert shimmering like molten copper in heat that could kill a man as surely as any bullet. Here, where the Sierra Nevada mountains cast shadows over alkali flats and ancient Joshua trees stood sentinel against an unforgiving sky. The very air tasted of dust and desperation. Rattlesnakes coiled beneath sagebrush, their warning calls a constant reminder that death lurked in every shadow, while coyotes howled mournful songs that echoed off canyon walls carved by millennia of wind and flash floods. In this harsh landscape, where civilization's grip was tenuous at best, a skeletal figure clawed desperately at a wooden feeding trough, her small hands splitting against rough-hewn planks as she battled a massive hog for rancid slop. The acrid smell of alkali dust mixed with the stench of pig waste, creating an atmosphere of desolation that seemed to mock any hope of human dignity. Aiyana's face, streaked with blood from a fresh gash above her left eye, plunged into the fetid mixture with the desperation of someone who had learned that starvation was a slower death than the whip. The beast squealed and snorted, its 200-pound bulk pressing against her 11-year-old frame, but she refused to yield. Fresh whip marks crisscrossed her back like a roadmap of recent agony, each laceration weeping through torn fabric that had once been Emma's favorite blue dress, the one their mama had sewn for her 8th birthday, just 3 weeks before the wolves came to their homestead outside Virginia City. Emma. Sweet Emma, with her gap-toothed smile and wooden doll named Mary, who used to sing lullabies while desert winds howled outside their cabin walls. Aiyana's fingers tightened around something sharp, a piece of broken mirror from Emma's doll, somehow lodged in the trough's corner during her desperate struggle. As she clutched this last remnant of her sister, a voice seemed to whisper in the desert wind. "Why didn't you save me, Aiyana? Why did you let the bad man hurt me?" The memory hit her like a physical blow, more painful than any whip. She had tried to save Emma, had screamed, and fought against her chains as Hota held her sister just out of reach. But she had been too small, too weak, too helpless to stop what happened next. The guilt was a living thing that gnawed at her soul, telling her she deserved to fight hogs for scraps, that she deserved every lash of the whip and every burn of the brand. "I'm sorry, Emma," she whispered through cracked lips. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." But her 3-day journey to reach this abandoned ranch outside Carson's Well had taught her things about survival that no child should ever have to learn. She had escaped Hota's camp not through luck, but through careful observation and desperate cunning. For 2 weeks, she had endured his training, the cage he kept her in like an animal, and the systematic brutality designed to break her spirit. The wolf brand burned into her shoulder to mark her as his property. Her escape had come during a sandstorm that swept across the Nevada desert like the wrath of ancient gods. While Hota's men huddled in their tents, waiting for the wind to die down, Aiyana had used a piece of broken glass, much like the one she now clutched, to cut through her bonds. She had stolen a horse from their remuda and ridden into the heart of the storm, trusting her life to the animal's instincts when her own vision failed. The stolen horse had carried her 30 miles before collapsing from exhaustion near an old mining claim, leaving her to continue on foot across terrain that could kill the unwary in a dozen different ways. She had navigated by the stars her father had taught her to read, had found water by following the flight patterns of desert birds, and had evaded Hota's search parties by hiding in abandoned mine shafts during the day and traveling only at night. One particularly harrowing encounter had nearly ended her flight to freedom. On her second night of travel, as she picked her way through a boulder field in the moonlight, she had stumbled upon one of Hota's scouts making camp in a hidden canyon. The man, a half-breed tracker called Crow Dog, had been roasting a rabbit over a small fire when she appeared at the canyon's rim like a ghost. "Well, well." He had set his hand, moving slowly toward the pistol at his hip. "If it isn't the boss's favorite little wolf pup, you've led us quite a chase, girl." But Aiyana had learned more during her captivity than Hota realized. She had observed how his men moved, how they thought how they could be deceived. Instead of running or pleading, she had done something unexpected. She had smiled. "He sent you alone?" she had asked, tilting her head like a curious child. "Just you to bring back his most valuable property." The question had given Crow Dog pause, and in that moment of hesitation, Aiyana had kicked sand into his fire. Darkness descended like a curtain, and by the time he managed to rekindle flames, she had vanished into the night like the desert spirit she was learning to become. Now, 72 hours later, she was reduced to fighting hogs for sustenance. But she was alive, and as long as she drew breath, there was hope. 25 miles southeast, where the red sand desert gave way to the shadow of the Ruby Mountains, Kangi Ironhawk felt the morning wind carry whispers of trouble on its scorching breath. At 35, the Lakota warrior possessed the stillness of deep water and the watchfulness of a man who had learned that peace in the Nevada territory was as rare and precious as water in the desert. His ranch sat in a natural basin protected by low hills with a spring that provided the most valuable commodity in this harsh land reliable water. The 300 acres he had claimed through careful negotiation with both territorial authorities and local Paiute bands was modest by Eastern standards. But it was paradise in a place where men had killed for less. The morning ritual of scanning the horizon for danger had become second nature, born from years of understanding that the desert could hide threats till they were close enough to kill. This morning, something felt different. The air held a tension that made his horses restless and sent lizards scurrying for shelter despite the early hour. Kangi's weathered hands, scarred by war and honest labor, held a cup of bitter coffee as he studied the landscape with eyes that missed nothing. In the distance, a dust devil danced across the alkali flats, but there was no wind to explain its presence. That meant riders, and riders in this country often meant trouble. 7 years had passed since smallpox swept through his village like wildfire from hell delivered in infected blankets that had been presented as gifts from white traders. The disease had taken everything: his wife Winona, their infant son Little Hawk, most of his extended family, and nearly half his tribe. What it had left behind was a man caught between worlds, surviving on stubbornness, and the growing belief that adaptation might be victory's quieter cousin. But this morning, as he watched that telltale dust plume grow larger, Kangi felt the familiar stirring of his warrior's instincts. Whatever was coming his way would test everything he had built in this harsh sanctuary he called home. "Boss." Thomas McCall's voice cracked across the morning stillness as he rode hard from the south pasture, his mare lathered with sweat and her sides heaving. At 20, Thomas had the enthusiasm of youth, but lacked the wisdom that came from seeing too much death too young. His sandy hair was white with alkali dust, and his face carried the urgency of someone bearing terrible news. "Boss, you gotta see this," Thomas called as he fought to control his spooked mount. "There's something real wrong down by Devil's Creek." Kangi set his coffee down with deliberate calm, but his hand automatically checked the position of the Colt revolver at his hip. In the Nevada territory, real wrong could mean anything from Apache raids to claimed jumpers to worse things that had no names in polite society. "What kind of wrong?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. "A kid, boss. Little girl, maybe 10 or 11. She's fighting the hogs for their feed, and she's hurt bad. Real bad. Jim tried approaching, but she ran like a spooked Mustang. Never seen anything like it. It's like she's more animal than child." The words hit Kangi like cold water. A child, alone and feral, fighting for survival in the harshest environment imaginable. In the Nevada territory, such a sight could only mean one thing: she was running from something even worse than the desert itself. Within minutes, Stormwalker carried Kangi toward Devil's Creek, with Thomas trailing behind. The bay gelding picked his way carefully across terrain that could lame a horse with a single misstep, loose shale, hidden gopher holes, and patches of alkali that could burn through leather. As they rode, Kangi's mind raced through possibilities, none of them pleasant. They found her exactly as Thomas had described, locked in desperate combat with a massive sow while two other hogs circled like vultures. The abandoned ranch where she had taken refuge was a testament to the desert's ability to reclaim what man tried to build. Adobe walls crumbled back to earth, wooden structures bleached white by the relentless sun, and scattered bones that might have belonged to cattle or something worse. But it was the child herself that made Kangi's blood run cold. Covered in mud and filth, her clothes reduced to blood-stained rags, she moved with the desperate efficiency of something that had learned survival was measured in heartbeats. Her dark hair matted with dirt and blood hung in tangles around a face that should have belonged to a child, but carried the hollow expression of someone who had seen hell and lived to remember every detail. Most disturbing of all was the way she fought not with the clumsy desperation of panic, but with calculated viciousness that spoke of training received in the worst possible school. Jim Hawkins stood 30 yards away, his weathered hat clutched in hands that had held rifles in 3 different wars. The grizzled cowpoke had survived everything the frontier could throw at a man, but the sight before him had shaken something fundamental in his composure. "Won't let us get near," Jim said quietly, his voice carrying the careful control that came from long experience with dangerous situations. Soon as she sees us coming, she goes wild, teeth-bared eyes, rolling like a cornered Mustang. Been watching her for near an hour, and it's breaking my heart. Whatever happened to that child, it broke something that ain't meant to be broken. Kangi dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The Nevada sun was already climbing toward its midday fury, and he could see the girl was suffering from more than just hunger. Heat, exhaustion, dehydration, and infection from untreated wounds would kill her long before starvation did. The girl noticed his approach immediately, her head snapping up from the trough with slop dripping from her chin. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their eyes met across the distance, and Kangi felt his heart break a little. He had seen that look before in the faces of his own people after cavalry raids, in the eyes of children who had learned that adults were predators first and protectors only by accident. But beneath the terror and desperate wariness, something else flickered in those dark eyes. Defiance. Small and fragile as a desert flower's first bloom, but unextinguished despite everything that had been done to crush it. "Aiyana," he said softly, using the Lakota word for eternal blossom. The unfamiliar sound made her tilt her head slightly, confusion temporarily replacing some of the fear. His voice carried authority without volume, promise without demand. "You thirsty?" Kangi continued, switching to English but keeping his tone gentle. "I got water. Clean water. Cool water." Her reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She pressed both hands to her throat, and he could see how parched she was, how the desert had been slowly killing her even as she fought for scraps. But she didn't move toward him, didn't reach for the promise of relief. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Without taking his eyes off her, Kangi reached for his canteen and took a small sip, then set it on a nearby rock and backed away. The message was clear. No tricks, no traps, just water for someone who desperately needed it. She darted forward like a striking rattlesnake, snatched the canteen, and retreated to safety. As she drank with desperate efficiency, spilling as much as she swallowed, Kangi got his first clear look at her injuries. The whip marks on her back were recent, some still oozing in the desert heat. Her feet were cut to ribbons from running barefoot across sharp rocks and thorns. She had probably lost 20 pounds during her ordeal, her growing body consuming its own muscle to stay alive, but it was the mark on her left shoulder that made his blood turn to ice. A fresh brand in the shape of a wolf's head, the skin around it still blistered and weeping with infection. The wound couldn't be more than a week old, burned deep into her flesh, with the kind of methodical cruelty that turned human beings into monsters. "Jesus Christ," Jim whispered, having moved close enough to see what Kangi had seen. "What kind of devil does that to a child?" "Amar Hota's kind," Kangi replied grimly, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. The name had been spreading across the Nevada territory like wildfire. Hota's Wolves, they called the gang, though some claimed the name itself was cursed and shouldn't be spoken aloud. Marcus Williamson, who now called himself Hota, after learning the Lakota word for gray wolf, specialized in a particular brand of evil that went beyond simple robbery or murder. His gang took children, broke them systematically, and used them as bait for elaborate death traps. The wolf brand was their signature, a way of marking their property and spreading their legend like a plague of fear. But Kangi knew things about Hota that most people didn't. Terrible knowledge that made this encounter feel personal in ways that went beyond simple compassion for a suffering child. The girl finished drinking and looked at him expectantly, some of the wild desperation fading from her eyes now that her most immediate need had been met. Her intelligence hadn't been completely destroyed by her ordeal. She was evaluating him, trying to determine whether he represented salvation or simply a different kind of threat. Kangi reached into his pack and withdrew his most precious possession, a buffalo robe that had been Winona's wedding gift to him, woven by her grandmother according to patterns that told the story of their love, in symbols that few white men would understand. He hadn't shared it with another human being since her death, hadn't even considered such a thing possible. But something about this broken child called to the protector that still lived in his warrior's heart. When he approached this time, the girl didn't retreat. Exhaustion had claimed too much of her strength, and some instinct deeper than learned caution seemed to recognize that this man posed no threat to her remaining dignity. When Kangi wrapped the buffalo robe around her small shoulders, she sagged into its warmth like someone who had forgotten that comfort existed in the world. "You're safe now," he told her, his voice steady as bedrock. "I give you my word, and among my people a man's word is his bond. No one will hurt you while I draw breath." "Boss," Thomas said nervously from his position near the horses. "Maybe we should take her to Carson's well. Doc Henderson could look at those wounds, and the preacher's wife knows about caring for—" "No." Kangi's response cut through the desert air like a blade, carrying a finality that brooked no argument. The thought of handing this broken child to strangers, no matter how well-intentioned, filled him with something close to rage. She had been betrayed by adults, tortured by men who should have protected her, branded like livestock, by creatures who saw children as property to be used and discarded. "She stays with me," he continued, his tone leaving no room for debate. "But what if whoever did this comes looking? What if there's trouble brewing because we helped her?" Kangi lifted the girl into his arms, startled by how light she was, how her small body trembled even in the warmth of the buffalo robe. She couldn't weigh more than 70 pounds, and the fact that she had survived her ordeal in the Nevada desert spoke to a strength of spirit that humbled him. "Then there will be trouble," he said with quiet finality. "And we'll face it when it comes." The ride back to the ranch house passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft whisper of wind through sagebrush. The girl, Aiyana, as Kangi had decided to call her, had fallen into an exhausted sleep in his arms, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated fatigue of terror and dehydration. He could feel the fever burning in her from infected wounds and knew that her survival was far from certain. But she had made it this far through the Nevada desert, one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. And that told him she possessed the kind of strength that couldn't be taught or inherited. It was forged in the crucible of suffering and emerged either stronger or completely destroyed. This child had chosen strength. At the ranch house, Kangi carried her inside and laid her on his own bed, the first time another person had slept there since Winona's death. He sent Thomas to Carson's well for medical supplies, with specific instructions to be discreet about his purchases. Then he dispatched Jim to ride the perimeter of their property, looking for any sign that they were being watched or that trouble was approaching across the desert. Finally, he set about the delicate work of treating her injuries, using knowledge gained as a warrior to heal wounds that no child should ever have to suffer. The whip marks were bad, but would heal cleanly if infection could be prevented. The brand was more serious, a deliberate mutilation designed to mark her as property rather than simply cause pain. As he worked by lamplight, washing away blood and grime with a gentleness he had once reserved for his infant son, Aiyana, stirred occasionally in her sleep. Her dreams were clearly troubled, filled with whimpers and thrashing that spoke of horrors beyond description. Each time the nightmares threatened to wake her, Kangi's voice seemed to calm the storm-low murmurs in Lakota that spoke of protection and peace. Takoja, he whispered, using the word for granddaughter, though they shared no blood. Sleep now. The spirits of the desert watch over you, and no harm will come while I stand guard. 3 days passed before Aiyana was strong enough to speak coherently. She had awakened several times to sip the broth Kangi prepared, a mixture of herbs and beef stock that his grandmother had sworn by for treating illness and injury. But she had remained silent throughout those early days, watching him with eyes that were slowly losing some of their haunted quality. On the evening of the 3rd day, as Kangi sat beside the bed reading by lamplight, she finally found her voice. "Why?" She asked the single word, carrying the weight of everything she had endured. Kangi set down his book, a collection of poetry that seemed incongruous in this harsh landscape, and looked at her with eyes that held their own share of pain. "Why, what little one, why help me? The other people I met after I got away, they turned their backs. Said I was probably lying, probably making up stories for attention." Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter this fragile sanctuary. "Because you needed help. And because you remind me of someone, I lost someone who deserved better than what this world gave her. Your daughter, my son. He would have been about your age now if the sickness hadn't taken him." The words came slowly, painfully, each one a small wound reopened. His name was Little Hawk, and he had eyes just like yours, dark and serious, but with a spark that said he wouldn't be broken easily. Aiyana absorbed this information silently, her young mind working through implications that most children never had to consider. "The man who hurt me," she said carefully. "He's still out there. He'll come looking eventually. I know. He's got others with him. Bad men who do terrible things. And there's this bounty hunter, Diego Vega. They call him the Wolf Hunter because he can track anyone anywhere. He never gives up, never stops hunting. I know that too. Then why aren't you afraid?" The question carried genuine puzzlement, as if she couldn't understand how anyone could know about Hota and not be terrified. Kangi smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Who says I'm not afraid? Fear keeps you alive if you use it right. But sometimes you have to be afraid and do the right thing anyway." Over the following weeks, as autumn brought cooler temperatures to the Nevada desert and the first snows began to dust the distant mountains, Aiyana slowly emerged from her shell of trauma. Her body healed faster than her spirit, but each day brought small victories that accumulated like water in a desert cistern. She learned to smile again when Kangi told her stories of Iktomi, the spider trickster, whose cleverness always overcame brute force. She discovered an almost supernatural talent for reading the moods and intentions of animals, horses, certainly, but also the desert creatures that most people feared. Rattlesnakes would coil peacefully in her presence. Coyotes would watch her with curious rather than predatory eyes. And even the wild mustangs that roamed the Ruby foothills seemed to accept her as something other than human threat. It's like she speaks their language. Jim observed one evening as they watched Aiyana communicate with a mustang that had wandered close to the ranch buildings. "Never seen anything like it. That horse should be spooked by human scent, but it's acting like she's part of the herd. She's learned to think like prey," Kangi replied quietly. "When you've been hunted by monsters, you understand how other hunted things feel." Most importantly, Aiyana gradually began to tell them about the hell she had escaped, releasing the poison of those memories in small doses that wouldn't overwhelm her fragile healing. The story that emerged was worse than anything they had imagined. His real name is Marcus Williamson. She revealed during one of their evening conversations on the ranch house porch. But he calls himself Hota now. Says it means gray wolf in Indian, and that wolves are the smartest hunters because they work together to bring down prey bigger than themselves. He lived among the Lakota. Kangi asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. For 2 years, he said. Learned the language, the customs, everything he needed to know to gain their trust. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Then the army offered him gold and land grants for information about village locations and winter camps. He said it was the easiest money he ever made. The confirmation hit Kangi like a physical blow, though he tried not to let his reaction show. He had suspected for years that someone with intimate knowledge of tribal customs had been guiding cavalry raids. But hearing it confirmed from the lips of one of Hota's victims made the betrayal feel fresh and personal. But there was more, and it was worse than anything Kangi could have imagined. He told me something else. Aiyana continued, her voice so quiet, it was almost lost in the desert wind. About the sickness that killed your family. He said he was the one who gave those traitors the infected blankets. Said the army paid him extra for that job because it would clear the land without having to fight for it. The world seemed to tilt sideways around Kangi. For 7 years he had lived with the grief of losing Winona and Little Hawk to disease, telling himself it was just another tragedy in a world full of them. To learn that their deaths had been deliberate, calculated murder carried out by someone who had shared their fire and eaten their food, it was almost too much to bear. "I'm sorry," Aiyana whispered, seeing the pain in his eyes. "I shouldn't have told you. I should have kept it secret." "No." Kangi said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "You were right to tell me. Now I know exactly what kind of monster we're dealing with." That night, after Aiyana had gone to sleep, Kangi sat on his porch, methodically cleaning his weapons by moonlight. His grief had transformed into something colder and more focused, a determination to ensure that Hota never hurt another innocent soul. This was no longer just about protecting one traumatized child. This was about justice for Winona and Little Hawk and every other victim of Hota's calculated evil. The next morning brought troubling news that confirmed their worst fears. Thomas returned from Carson's Well with supplies and gossip that painted a picture of escalating violence across the territory. The Henderson family's homestead 20 miles north had been found burned to the ground with no trace of the family, except for a child's doll nailed to their gatepost with railroad spikes. "There's more, boss," Thomas said, his young face grim with knowledge that aged him beyond his years. "Been strangers asking questions around town. Men with red wolf tattoos wanting to know about any children that might have turned up recently, especially little girls matching a specific description. But the worst news came from an unexpected source. Sarah Mackenzie rode into their yard just as Thomas finished his report out. At one look at her face told them that their troubles were about to multiply. Sarah was 16 with auburn hair and green eyes that held the same haunted quality they had learned to recognize in Aiyana's gaze. "They sent me to find you," Sarah said without preamble as Kangi helped her down from her exhausted horse. "Hota's got my little sister Lily. She's only 6 years old, and he said he'll kill her if I don't bring back information about your defenses." "You're one of his," Aiyana stated flatly, though there was no accusation in her voice, only weary recognition. "Was. For 8 months, ever since they took our family." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "But I can't do it anymore. I won't help him hurt more children, even if it means Lily dies. At least this way, maybe some good can come from all the evil." The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. Sarah wasn't just a messenger, she was living proof that Hota's corruption ran deeper than simple murder and kidnapping. He turned his victims into accomplices forced them to participate in their own degradation and the destruction of others. "How many men does he have?" Kangi asked his tactical mind, already beginning to formulate plans. 20, maybe 25. Plus Diego Vega and his tracking team. They're camped about 10 miles north in the old mining town of Goldfield, or what's left of it. The place has been abandoned since the silver played out, but it gives them good defensive positions and plenty of hiding places. What exactly does Hota want? Aiyana first and foremost. He's obsessed with her. She's the first person who ever escaped from him, and it's driven him half mad with rage. But he also wants you dead, Kangi. Says you've interfered with his business for the last time. Sarah paused, her voice dropping even lower. And he's got more than just his usual gang. There's a man called Red Cloud, not the chief, just someone using the name who's been recruiting among the displaced tribes. Promises them revenge against the whites who took their land. The name sent ice through Kangi's veins. He knew the real Red Cloud had fought beside him in the old days, and knew that the great chief would never stoop to Hota's level of evil. But desperate men might follow anyone who promised them a chance to strike back at their oppressors. "How long do we have?" He gave me 3 days to return with information. If I don't show up, or if I bring back the wrong message, he'll assume you've chosen to fight and start the attack. That gave them roughly 60 hours to prepare for a battle against overwhelming odds with innocent lives hanging in the balance. It should have been impossible. But Kangi had faced impossible odds before and lived to tell about it. As he called toward the barn, "Get everyone together. We need to talk." What followed was the most intense planning session of Kangi's life. Maps were spread across the kitchen table, hand-drawn sketches of the surrounding terrain, detailed observations of wind patterns and seasonal water sources, tactical assessments of defensive positions and escape routes. The adults huddled around the table while Aiyana listened from her position by the window, occasionally offering insights that demonstrated her growing understanding of warfare. "Here's what we know." Kangi began using a pencil to mark positions on the largest map. 25 men, experienced fighters led by someone who's never lost a battle. They've got a tracker who's legendary for his skill, they've got hostages to prevent us from simply running, and they've got the advantage of numbers and mobility. "Those aren't exactly encouraging odds, boss," Thomas observed, though his voice remained steady. "No, they're not. But we have advantages they don't know about. This is our ground. We know every rock, every wash, every place where a man might find cover. We've got defensive positions already prepared, and we've got something they can't buy or steal." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "We're fighting for something that matters more than money or reputation. We're fighting for family." The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its reliance on perfect timing. The ranch house would serve as bait, drawing Hota's forces into a carefully prepared killing field. But the real battle would be fought in the desert itself, using the harsh environment as a weapon against enemies who thought they understood its dangers. "The key is misdirection," Kangi explained as he outlined their strategy. "They're expecting us to ford up and wait for them to come to us. Instead, we're going to give them what they think they want, and then hit them where and when they don't expect it." Aiyana spent the evening preparing arrows with an intensity that spoke of someone who understood that her life might depend on the straightness of each shaft. Her small hands worked with surprising skill, guided by techniques Kangi had taught her, and motivated by the knowledge that tomorrow would test everything she had learned. "Are you scared?" Sarah asked as they worked side by side in the lamplight. "Terrified," Aiyana replied honestly. "But scared and helpless aren't the same thing. I've been helpless before, and I won't be helpless again." The attack came at dawn, just as Sarah had predicted. But it began with psychological warfare, designed to break their will to resist before the first shot was fired. As the eastern sky began to lighten, riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch, dark silhouettes against the brightening horizon. They sat motionless for several minutes, allowing the defenders to count their numbers and contemplate the odds they faced. Then, in a move calculated to inspire maximum terror, they began displaying their hostages. Small figures were brought forward and placed where they could be clearly seen from the ranch house. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, there was no mistaking the Morrison children, Tommy barely 5 years old, and his sister Katie, perhaps 7. They were bound hand and foot, and even from this distance, it was clear they had been mistreated during their captivity. "Can you see them?" Hota's voice carried clearly across the morning air, amplified by the desert's acoustic properties. "Take a good look, Kangi Ironhawk. Those children's lives depend on the choices you make in the next few minutes." A shot rang out from the ridge, and little Katie crumpled to the ground. For a heart-stopping moment, it appeared that Hota had murdered a child to make his point. But then the girl struggled back to sitting position, and it became clear that the shot had been deliberately aimed to miss a demonstration of how quickly the situation could turn lethal. Now that was just a warning. Hota continued his voice, carrying clearly in the thin desert air. "The next shot won't miss unless I get what I came for. Send out the wolf girl and that half-breed bastard who's been harboring her." From her position by the window, Aiyana felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The sight of those children bound and helpless facing death because of decisions she had made brought back every nightmare she had fought to overcome. But Kangi's hand on her shoulder steadied her, reminded her that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust in the people who cared about you. "Remember the plan," he said quietly. "Trust in your training, trust in your weapons, and trust that we're fighting for something worth dying for." What happened next unfolded with terrible precision. Jim, positioned in the barn loft, with their best rifle, sent his first shot across the impossible distance to the ridge. The bullet took one of Hota's men from his saddle, the sharp crack echoing off the canyon walls and announcing that surrender wasn't an option. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 20 rifles opened fire simultaneously, filling the air with thunder and the whistle of bullets. The ranch house shook under the impact of lead-striking adobe, and wood windows exploded in showers of glass, and the morning air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. But this was only the opening move in a deadly chess game. As Hota's men charged down from the ridge, whooping and firing their weapons, they rode directly into the trap that Kangi had spent weeks preparing. Hidden rifle pits erupted with muzzle flashes. Carefully placed obstacles channeled the attack into predetermined zones, and the defenders' superior knowledge of the terrain began to tell. The first wave of attackers made it to within 50 yards of the house before the concealed defenses revealed themselves. Jim's rifle spoke again from the barn, and another rider pitched from his saddle. Thomas, positioned behind a stone wall that provided excellent cover, began working his repeating rifle with mechanical precision. But it was Aiyana who provided the day's first real surprise. As 3 riders broke away from the main attack to circle behind the house, she appeared at the kitchen window with her bow drawn. Her first shot seemed impossible 60 yards at a moving target, but the arrow took the lead rider's horse in the chest, sending both animal and man tumbling in a cloud of dust. Her second arrow caught the next rider in the shoulder, spinning him around in his saddle. The third man, seeing his companions fall to what appeared to be a child with a primitive weapon, spurred his horse directly toward the window in a rage. He was 20 yards away when Aiyana's third arrow took him through the throat. Jesus Christ. Thomas breathed from his position at the stone wall. That little girl just dropped 3 grown men. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. Even as the first wave fell back in confusion, Hota was already adapting his tactics. Instead of continuing the frontal assault, he split his remaining forces and began a more methodical approach. What came next was both brilliant and terrifying in its simplicity. Instead of attacking the house directly, Hota sent half his men to set fire to the sagebrush upwind from the ranch. Within minutes, thick smoke began rolling across the defensive positions, reducing visibility to mere yards and making accurate shooting nearly impossible. But the smoke was only the beginning of Hota's tactical innovations. Under cover of the gray wall that now surrounded the ranch, his archers' men who had learned their skills from various tribes began launching fire arrows at the buildings. The barn caught first its dried timber, erupting in flames that sent sparks dancing across the yard like deadly fireflies. "The barn's gone," Jim shouted as he slid down a rope from the loft, flames licking at his heels. "And we just lost our best firing position." Worse was yet to come. As the smoke thickened and visibility dropped to almost nothing, Sarah suddenly appeared in the kitchen doorway with a pistol in her trembling hands. Her face was streaked with tears, and her voice broke as she spoke. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the gun wavering as she pointed it toward Aiyana. "I'm so sorry, but he's got Lily. My little sister, she's only 6 years old, and he said he'd skin her alive if I didn't." The words caught in her throat as she struggled with her conflicting loyalties. "Please don't make me do this," she begged, the pistol shaking in her grip. "He made me watch what he did to the Morrison parents. He made me watch everything, and he said that's what would happen to Lily if I didn't help him." Thomas reacted first, lunging across the room to wrestle the gun away from her. In the struggle, the weapon discharged the bullet, going wide and shattering a lamp instead of finding its intended target. But the damage was done. Their defensive plan had been compromised, and their position was no longer secure. "He made me do it." Sarah sobbed as Thomas pinned her to the floor. "I didn't want to, but Lily's all I have left. She's just a baby." The revelation added another layer of moral complexity to an already desperate situation. Sarah wasn't a willing traitor. She was another victim forced to choose between competing loyalties by a monster who specialized in turning people's love against them. But there was no time to sort out ethical implications. Even as Thomas struggled to restrain Sarah, new sounds from outside announced the next phase of Hota's attack. Through the dissipating smoke, they could see riders moving into position for what looked like a coordinated assault from multiple directions. "Everybody to the cellar," Kangi shouted. "This house is about to become a death trap." The cellar beneath the ranch house had been designed as both storm shelter and last resort defensive position. Its walls were thick adobe reinforced with stones, and the ceiling was supported by heavy timber beams that could withstand considerable punishment. It wasn't perfect protection against determined attackers, but it was better than staying exposed in the main house. As they descended the narrow stairs, Aiyana grabbed her bow and the arrows she had left, knowing they might be all that stood between her and recapture. The cellar was cramped and dark, lit only by a single lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. But Kangi had one more surprise prepared for his enemies. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a cache of dynamite he had purchased for clearing stumps, along with the fuses and caps needed to make it useful as a weapon. As the house burned above them and Hota's men closed in for the kill, he began preparing charges that would turn their shelter into a tomb for anyone foolish enough to enter. "When I light these fuses," he told the others, "you have exactly 1 minute to get out through the tunnel. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run for Devil's Creek and keep running until you reach the cave." The tunnel he referred to was another of his preparations. A narrow passage he had dug during the winter months that connected the cellar to a hidden exit among the rocks near the creek. It was barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through, but it would get them out without being seen. "What about you?" Aiyana asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Someone has to stay behind to light the fuses and make sure they don't follow you immediately. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "I have personal business to settle with Hota." The explosion that followed could be heard 20 miles away, across the desert. The ranch house disappeared in a mushroom cloud of fire and debris that sent burning timbers flying in all directions. Several of Hota's men, caught too close to the blast, were killed instantly or badly wounded by flying wreckage. But when the smoke cleared and the debris stopped falling, Hota himself was still very much alive and angrier than anyone had ever seen him. The loss of several more men combined with the destruction of what should have been an easy victory had pushed him beyond rational thought into pure vindictive rage. "Find them!" he screamed at his surviving followers, his cultured facade completely abandoned. "I don't care if you have to turn over every rock in the territory. They couldn't have gone far, and I want that girl alive, even if you have to kill everyone else to get her." The chase that followed led through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Nevada territory. Kangi Aiyana, Jim Thomas, and Sarah, who had thrown in her lot with them completely after her confession, made their way through hidden canyons and secret paths that few white men knew existed. They were guided by Kangi's intimate knowledge of the land and driven by the knowledge that capture meant death or worse. But Hota had Diego Vega tracking them, and the bounty hunter lived up to his fearsome reputation. Despite their best efforts to cover their trail, despite doubling back and traveling over rock to avoid leaving tracks, Vega stayed on their scent like a bloodhound. His mixed blood heritage and decades of experience made him nearly impossible to shake. The pursuit led them deep into the Nevada desert, where the sun was an enemy as dangerous as any human tracker. Water became precious beyond gold, and each step forward was paid for with suffering that tested the limits of human endurance. By the second day, they were reduced to traveling only at night, hiding during the brutal daylight hours in whatever shade they could find. It was during one of these rest periods, huddled in the lee of a rock formation that provided minimal protection from the blazing sun, that they encountered another group of refugees from Hota's evil. Billy Henderson emerged from the rocks like a ghost, his young face gaunt with hunger and marked by experiences that had aged him beyond his years. "I thought I heard voices." Billy said, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol that looked too large for his 13-year-old frame. "You folks running from the same wolf that got my family." The boy's story, told in clipped sentences that carried more weight than any elaborate narrative, painted a picture of systematic horror that made even their own experiences seem mild by comparison. The Henderson homestead had been hit 3 days earlier, his parents and younger siblings taken or killed, while he had hidden in the root cellar like a coward, his word, though none of them saw it that way. "I've been tracking them ever since," Billy concluded, his young voice carrying an adult's understanding of what needed to be done. "Figure I owe them something for what they did to my ma and pa." "You're just a boy," Jim protested, though his tone suggested he already knew the argument was futile. "So's she," Billy replied, nodding toward Aiyana. "Doesn't seem to be stopping her from doing what needs doing." And so their small band of refugees became an army of sorts, united not by nationality or ideology, but by shared trauma and the determination to ensure that no other family suffered as theirs had. The confrontation they had all been dreading finally came to a head in a place that seemed designed by the gods for epic battles. Devil's Canyon was a maze of red sandstone formations that had been sacred to local tribes for generations, a place where the earth itself seemed to hold memories of ancient conflicts and older magic. The canyon got its name from the way the wind howled through its narrow passages, creating sounds that resembled the cries of tormented souls. But there was nothing supernatural about the danger it represented to people caught within its walls. The passages were narrow, the walls were high, and there were only a few ways in or out. It was here that Hota's superior numbers would be neutralized by terrain that favored defenders, and here that the final chapter of their struggle would be written in blood and stone. They made their stand on a high ridge overlooking the canyon floor, with steep cliffs on 3 sides, and only one narrow path leading to their position. It was defensible ground, but it was also a trap. If Hota's men could get past their defenses, there would be nowhere to retreat. "This is where we make our stand," Kangi announced as they prepared their weapons for what everyone knew would be their last battle. "We can't run any farther, and those children back at the ranch deserve justice for what was done to them." But even as they prepared for the final confrontation, Hota had one more cruel surprise in store for them. As the sun reached its zenith and the canyon floor shimmered with heat distortion, A lone rider appeared at the canyon's mouth. It was Diego Vega, and he carried something that made Aiyana's blood turn to ice. Tommy Morrison sat in front of the bounty hunter, barely conscious and clearly suffering from dehydration and abuse. The 5-year-old boy, who had been through more horror than most adults would ever experience, was being used as a human shield by a man who had sold his soul for money and reputation. "Afternoon, folks." Vega called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with mocking cheerfulness. "Got something here that belongs to you, or maybe something you'd like to keep in one piece." "Let the boy go, Vega." Kangi called back. "Your quarrel is with us, not with children." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, friend. See, this little one is my insurance policy. You folks have caused my employer considerable inconvenience, and he's asked me to make sure there are no more unpleasant surprises." Vega's laugh was like breaking glass. "So here's how this works. You send down the wolf girl nice and peaceful-like, and I let the boy live. You try anything heroic, and he takes a very long fall off a very high cliff." The ultimatum hung in the desert air like a physical presence, weighing down their souls with the impossible choice between saving one child and sacrificing another. But it was Tommy himself who broke the terrible silence. "Don't you do it." "Miss Aiyana," the boy called out, his young voice cracking with exhaustion, but firm with determination. "Don't you let them bad men win, my ma, and Pa wouldn't want that." "Shut up, boy," Vega snarled, raising his hand to strike the child. That's when Billy Henderson made his choice. The 13-year-old boy who had lost everything to Hota's evil rose from concealment with his oversized pistol in both hands and sent a bullet across an impossible distance to take Diego Vega in the shoulder. It wasn't a killing shot. Billy was good, but not that good. But it was enough to spoil the bounty hunter's grip on his hostage. Tommy, small and quick as only a 5-year-old, could be wriggled free and rolled behind a boulder before Vega could recover. The boy was safe for the moment, but their position had been revealed and the battle was about to begin in earnest. What followed was a running fight among the red rocks that tested every skill they had learned and every ounce of courage they could muster. Hota's men came at them from multiple directions, using their superior numbers to probe for weaknesses, while the canyon's acoustic properties turned every gunshot into rolling thunder that echoed endlessly off the stone walls. Aiyana's bow sang its deadly song, sending arrows into the advancing attackers with precision that would have amazed seasoned hunters. Her small size and incredible speed allowed her to move through the maze of rocks like a desert spirit, always staying one step ahead of the men trying to corner her. But it was the moment when she became trapped in a pocket of flame that truly tested her newfound abilities. A fire arrow had ignited a patch of sagebrush behind her position, and the wind was pushing the flames directly toward her hiding place. Smoke filled her lungs and made her eyes water while the heat threatened to cook her alive. In that moment of crisis, her strange connection to animals proved to be her salvation. A wild mustang panicked by the fire, and smoke came charging through the flames directly toward her position. Instead of running, Aiyana reached out with her mind, the way Kangi had taught her, projecting calm and confidence toward the terrified animal. The mustang slowed and then stopped its sides, heaving with exertion and fear. But when Aiyana approached with her hands extended, it allowed her to climb onto its back. Together, they burst through the wall of flame, and Smoke Girl and Horse moving as one entity in a display of trust that seemed to transcend the natural world. "Did you see that?" Thomas breathed from his position among the rocks. She just rode a wild mustang through fire like some kind of desert goddess, but their amazement was short-lived. Even as Aiyana escaped her fiery trap, Kangi found himself facing the confrontation he had been dreading since learning the truth about his family's death. Hota appeared on the ridge opposite their position, his expensive coat torn and bloody, his face twisted with 7 years of accumulated hatred. "Boss, Kangi Ironhawk," the outlaw leader called across the canyon. Time to finish what I started in your village all those years ago. This time, I'll make sure there are no survivors to carry tales. Come and try. Kangi replied, rising from cover with his grandfather's bow in his hands. But you'll find me a harder target than women and children. What followed was a duel that seemed to encapsulate everything the frontier represented. Old ways against new honor, against greed, protection, against predation. Hota carried the latest in military weaponry, a rifle with telescopic sights that could kill at incredible distances. Kangi bore a weapon crafted according to techniques unchanged for centuries, requiring skill and strength rather than mechanical precision. They circled each other among the rocks like wolves seeking advantage, each shot carefully calculated and aimed with deadly intent. Hota's first bullet came close enough to Kangi's head to part his hair-chipping stone and sending fragments flying. But before he could work the bolt for a second shot, Kangi's arrow was already in flight. The shaft took Hota in the left shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his rifle. But the outlaw leader was far from finished. He drew his revolver and began advancing while firing each shot carefully aimed despite his wound. You should have stayed dead with the rest of your people. Hota snarled between shots. That girl belongs to me. I marked her, I trained her, and I'll be damned if I'll let some broken-down Indian keep my property. She's not property, Kangi replied, knocking another arrow despite the bullets flying around him. She's a child, and children deserve protection from monsters like you. His second arrow caught Hota in the leg, bringing the outlaw to one knee, but not stopping his advance. With ammunition running low and his enemy still coming, Kangi reached for what he knew would be his final arrow, or the one that would either end this nightmare or cost him his life. But as he drew the bow for his last shot, disaster struck. A hidden rifleman, one of Hota's men positioned on a ledge high above the canyon floor, sent a bullet into Kangi's right shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to lose his grip on the arrow. Now you die. Hota roared, rising to his feet despite his wounds and raising his pistol for the killing shot. That's when Sarah Mackenzie proved that redemption was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. The 16-year-old girl who had been forced to betray them appeared from behind a boulder with a rifle in her hands, and her shot took Hota's gunman before he could finish what he had started. That's for my sister. She screamed, working the bolt to chamber another round. And for every child you've hurt. Her intervention gave Kangi the seconds he needed to recover his bow and nock his final arrow. This time, when he drew the string back to his cheek, there was no hesitation, no doubt, no possibility of missing. The arrow flew true, taking Hota through the heart with surgical precision. The outlaw leader looked down at the shaft protruding from his chest with something approaching wonder. A savage's toy, he whispered, blood foaming on his lips. Killed by a savage's toy. He toppled backward onto the red stone, his blood soaking into rocks that had witnessed countless such scenes over the millennia. The man who had caused so much suffering, who had turned children into weapons and love into a tool of torture, was finally still. The surviving members of his gang, seeing their leader fall and facing enemies who seemed to appear from the rocks themselves, decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They scattered like tumbleweeds in a strong wind, their appetite for battle evaporating along with their prospects for easy money. In the sudden quiet that followed the end of gunfire, the survivors slowly emerged from their positions to survey the aftermath of their victory. The cost had been terrible. Jim was dead killed during the initial assault, and Thomas was wounded in the arm. But they were alive, and more importantly, they were free. As the sun set over Devil's Canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to honor the blood spilled in defense of innocence, Aiyana walked slowly to where Hota's body lay sprawled among the stones. For so many months, this man had been the monster in her nightmares, the embodiment of everything cruel and evil in the world. Now he looked smaller somehow, just another corpse that would feed the vultures and be forgotten by history. "Is it really over?" Tommy Morrison asked, appearing at her side with the resilience that seemed to characterize children who had survived the unsurvivable. Kangi approached and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his own wound roughly bandaged, but his spirit intact. "It's over, Takoja. You're free now, truly free. The wolf no longer has any power over you." That night, as they made camp in a hidden canyon that had served as sanctuary for Kangi's people in ancient times, they held a ceremony for Jim Hawkins. The grizzled cowpoke was buried according to frontier custom with his rifle and his personal effects, while his friends shared stories of his courage and loyalty. It was a simple service, but it honored a man who had died protecting children he barely knew, because it was the right thing to do. "He didn't have any family," Thomas said, as they stood around the grave, marked with stones arranged in the traditional pattern. "But he always said we were his family." Guess he meant it. 3 days later, they returned to what remained of the ranch to find a miracle waiting for them. The Morrison children had been found by a search party from Carson's Well, abandoned by their captors, when Hota's organization collapsed. They were hungry and frightened, but alive and unharmed. Tommy Morrison, the youngest at barely 5 years old, ran straight to Aiyana when he saw her wrapping his small arms around her waist with the desperate intensity of someone who had found his protector. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice muffled against her shirt. "I told Katie you'd come back and save us just like you saved yourself." It was then that Aiyana made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She took the buffalo robe that Kangi had wrapped around her that first day, the robe that had meant safety and warmth and belonging, and gently placed it around Tommy's small shoulders. "This is yours now," she told the boy who had lost his parents to the same evil that had taken her family. "It kept me safe when I needed it most. Now it's your turn." Tommy looked up at her with eyes that held gratitude beyond his years. "But what about you? Won't you need it?" Aiyana touched the scar on her shoulder, where a skilled artist in Carson's Well had transformed Hota's wolf brand into something beautiful. A desert flower blooming defiantly through the original mark, with the Lakota word for hope flowing beneath it in elegant script. "I don't need it anymore," she replied with certainty that surprised her with its strength. "I carry my protection inside now, and no one can take that away from me." But their moment of reunion was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. A small group of riders approached under a white flag, led by a man who introduced himself as Marshal Samuel Crawford. He had been tracking Hota's gang for months, and the smoke from their final battle had drawn him to investigate. Miss Crawford said to Aiyana after hearing their story, "What you folks have accomplished here is remarkable. More than remarkable, it's unprecedented. I'm here on behalf of the territorial government to make you an offer." The proposal he outlined was both generous and troubling. Federal funding, legal authority support from territorial militia when needed, everything they would need to continue their work on a larger scale. But it came with strings-attached requirements to follow federal guidelines about how they conducted their operations. What's the catch? Aiyana asked her experience with authority figures, making her suspicious of anything that sounded too good to be true. "The catch is that you'd have to operate within the law. No more vigilante justice, no more operating outside proper channels. Everything would have to be done by the book with appropriate paperwork and oversight." Aiyana looked out across the desert that had become her home, where children were learning to heal from trauma and build new lives from the ashes of their old ones. All of it had been accomplished outside the law through direct action that governments found uncomfortable to acknowledge. "Thank you for the offer, Marshal Crawford," she said finally. "But we'll continue doing things our own way. Some work is too important to be left to politicians and bureaucrats." As autumn brought cooler temperatures to the Nevada desert, their small community began to rebuild from the ashes of destruction. Word spread quietly through certain circles that there was a place where lost children could find safety and purpose, where broken souls could heal and learn to trust again. The new ranch house was built on the same foundation as the old, but larger and stronger, designed to accommodate the growing number of young people who found their way to this sanctuary in the desert. Billy Henderson proved to have a natural talent for teaching others to shoot, while Sarah Mackenzie used her knowledge of criminal networks to identify children who needed rescue. But it was Aiyana who became the heart of their growing organization. At 13, she commanded respect from adults twice her age and could move through hostile territory like a desert spirit. More importantly, she had learned to transform pain into purpose survival, into strength, fear, into determination. "You know," Billy said to her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the western sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, "sometimes I think about what my pa would say if he could see what we've built here. All these kids who might have died or worse if they hadn't found this place. What do you think he'd say? That we turned our pain into something useful. That we found a way to make their deaths matter by preventing other deaths." Billy's voice carried the weight of someone who had learned that the best revenge against evil was refusing to let it win. And I think he'd be proud that his son helped build something worth protecting. On her 14th birthday, as Aiyana stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars emerge in the clear Nevada sky, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The terrified child who had fought hogs for scraps seemed like someone from another lifetime. Someone she remembered with compassion, but no longer recognized as herself. "The wolf doesn't follow me anymore," she said quietly to the desert wind, her hand unconsciously touching the transformed scar on her shoulder. "I carry the wolf with me now, but it serves my purposes, not its own. And maybe that's the real victory, not killing the monsters, but refusing to become one yourself." Kangi emerged from the house and joined her on the porch, his hair now more gray than black, but his bearing still straight and proud. In his hands was a small package wrapped in soft leather. "I have something for you," he said, his voice carrying an emotion she had rarely heard from him. "Something that belonged to Winona. She would have wanted you to have it." Inside the package was a necklace of turquoise and silver, crafted according to Lakota traditions that spoke of protection and strength. As he fastened it around her neck, Kangi spoke words that transformed their relationship forever. "You are my daughter now in all the ways that matter. Not by blood, but by choice and love and shared struggle. Will you accept an old warrior as your father?" "I thought you already were." Aiyana replied, tears streaming down her face as she embraced the man who had saved her life and given her a future worth living. As night settled over the Nevada territory, bringing with it the promise of another day and another chance to make a difference, father and daughter sat together in comfortable silence. They had built something precious from the ruins of their respective tragedies, not just a successful ranch, but a sanctuary where broken souls could heal and learn to become healers themselves. The story of the girl who ate pig slop and the Lakota warrior who saved her had become legend told and retold around countless campfires. But the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about the power of human compassion to triumph over human cruelty, about the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances, about the way hope could bloom like desert flowers in the most unlikely places. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound carrying across miles of open country. Somewhere in that vast expanse of sky and earth, other children were fighting their own battles against darkness. Some would fall as children had always fallen, in a world that was often cruel and always uncertain. But others would survive, as Aiyana had survived as Billy and Tommy, and Sarah had survived as countless others would survive in the years to come. They would find their own sanctuaries, their own protectors, their own reasons to hope. And in finding them, they would discover the same truth that Aiyana had learned during her long journey from despair to redemption, that the human spirit, however broken, however scarred, however marked by the wolves of the world, possessed a strength that could not be destroyed by those who sought to possess and corrupt it. The girl who had once eaten pig slop from a trough had become a woman who offered hope to the hopeless. The Lakota warrior, who had lost everything to disease and betrayal, had found new purpose in protecting the innocent. Together, they had written a story of survival and redemption that would inspire others long after they themselves had returned to the earth that had shaped them. And in the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.